Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Warren Hoge, IPI's Senior Advisor for External Relations, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this Speaker Series event co-sponsored by IPI and the Permanent Mission of Sweden to the United Nations, and featuring António Guterres, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Mr. Guterres will be speaking on the occasion of the release today of the new UNHCR publication, The State of the World's Refugees in Search of Solidarity. And I've been asked to tell you that these flyers are available now in the UN bookstore, and this is the way one purchases that book. We don't have them here, but they're in the UN bookstore. The publication, and I've also got two versions of it here. The publication that Mr. Guterres just held up, it's in hardcover and softcover editions. It's been produced by the Oxford University Press. And as we said in our invitation, it is an up-to-date and highly accessible overview of key developments from 2006 to 2012 related to internal and cross-border displacement of people throughout the world. I just want to add, I wrote that line before I actually had read the book, and I since have read the book, and it really is, I was telling one of the people from UNHCR just a while ago, my background is editorial, it's very well presented, it's quite accessible, and so I'm happy that I wrote those words last week before I'd actually had to look at the book myself. The book shows how the agency's work over time has broadened since its creation in 1951 to deal with refugee problems remaining from World War II, to include people displaced within the borders of their own country and stateless people, in addition to those who flee across borders to escape conflict and persecution. A central theme of the book is how to develop international solidarity to help states shoulder their responsibilities for the forcibly displaced. The UN Refugee Agency now works in more than 120 countries with some 35 million refugees and displaced persons, and it's grown into one of the world's largest international humanitarian agencies. You have the full biographies of our two speakers in your papers, so let me just introduce them here briefly. As I said at the outset, our partner in putting on this meeting today is the Permanent Mission of Sweden. And following me up here in a moment to make welcoming remarks will be Marten Grunditz, who has been the permanent representative of Sweden to the United Nations since June of 2010. Prior to his appointment, he was Secretary General of the Swedish European Union Presidency Secretariat and Ambassador to Greece, and his long career in the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs has included postings in China, the United States, Switzerland, and Great Britain, in addition to ranking positions in Stockholm. And then we will hear from António Guterres, who became the 10th UN High Commissioner for Refugees in June of 2005, and was re-elected by the UN General Assembly to a second five-year term in April of 2010. He was the Prime Minister of Portugal from 1995 to 2002 and was particularly active at that time in the international effort to resolve the crisis in Timor-Leste. As President of the European Council in early 2000, he led the adoption of the Economic, Social, and Environmental Renewal Plan for Europe, known as the Lisbon Agenda, and he co-chaired the first European Union Africa Summit. He also founded the Portuguese Refugee Council in 1991. So, Ambassador Grunditz, welcome to IPI, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Warren, and through you, thank you to IPI for providing us once again with an excellent platform for an important event. Mr. High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to offer a few opening remarks at this timely event, held in conjunction with the launch of the UNHCR new edition of The State of the World Refugees. This periodical publication, which now appears for the 6th time, constitutes an important contribution to global policy and practice relating to forced displacements. It's also a great honor for me to be here together with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. António Guterres, who I met first time during the Portuguese presidency in the beginning of the first decade of this century. Last year marked the 60th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention and of the office of the UNHCR. In the 6 decades that have passed since the Refugee Convention was signed, the world has witnessed dramatic changes. Many brutal wars and conflicts have come to an end. Unfortunately, we all know that new conflicts still force people to leave their homes to seek refuge from violence and persecution, often across international borders. The Refugee Convention and the UNHCR are therefore as relevant today as they were 60 years ago. As evidence continues to show, humanitarian needs are increasing and getting more complex. For these reasons, there is clearly a need to focus even more on coordination, preparedness, and prevention. We cannot foresee or be prepared for all scenarios, but the signs of an approaching humanitarian crisis are often visible sometime before the situation becomes acute. It thus makes sense to invest more in building resilience among local communities to prevent crises from happening and better bridge development efforts and humanitarian action before, during, and after a crisis, all in order to reduce displacement. My country, Sweden, is proud of being a strong supporter, both politically and financially, of the UNHCR. I would like to take this opportunity to extend our deepest gratitude to the dedicated staff of the UNHCR for their tireless efforts in bringing protection and assistance to millions of persons around the world. I would also like to thank the High Commissioner himself for his strong and forward-looking leadership of the UNHCR and for initiating and continuously working with reforming the organization. Mr. High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, 6 years have passed since the last edition of the State of the World Refugees. In the meantime, some new trends have emerged, but many of the old challenges remain. The overarching theme of the new edition is solidarity, solidarity with the forcibly displaced and with the recipient countries that host them. As you highlight in your foreword, Mr. High Commissioner, solidarity is extended on many different levels, from individuals, local communities, states, humanitarian organizations, and increasingly also from the private sector. These different forms of solidarity are essential in order to meet one of the main global challenges of our time, to protect and assist the most vulnerable people of the world. I would like to highlight some issues which are raised in the new edition. In one of the chapters, the importance of renewed efforts to reach durable solutions and the growing constraints to achieving them is examined. Although it is clear that the dominant solution today is voluntary repatriation, local integration also plays a crucial role. And another vital instrument of international solidarity is resettlement. In the last edition, it is recommended that the internationalization of settlement should be strengthened. And it would be interesting to listen to the High Commissioner commenting on this. Is there an increased acceptance among countries to establish resettlement quotas? After all, as things stand now, only 4 countries receive 94% of all resettled refugees. And it would be interesting to hear what the current trends and challenges are when it comes to achieve more durable solutions in regard to resettlement. Another issue that is becoming increasingly important and is being examined in more detail in the new edition is displacement in urban environments and the specific protection challenges that people face in that context. One challenge in an urban setting is, of course, that it can be harder to reach people of concern. Protection and assistance must therefore be delivered and linked to development assistance and build on enhanced partnership with local authorities. It would be interesting to hear the High Commissioner elaborating on this issue and what the trends and the way forward for the future are. To close up, the new edition, which covers the period 2006-2011, provides useful analysis and knowledge on a range of current trends pertaining to the forcibly displaced around the world. It is indeed recommended reading for anyone, and I agree completely. It's extremely well set out and well drafted. Recommended reading for anyone, academics and practitioners alike, who wants to deepen their understanding of one of the most pressing global humanitarian challenges of our time. I look forward to hearing what the High Commissioner has to say on some of the current trends pertaining to the world's refugees. I thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Chairman, Ambassador, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here. First of all, to be in the IPI, where I've been many times, and that I've always seen in the forefront of the meaningful debates about peace, security, but also about key humanitarian issues, and to have the special sponsorship by Sweden. Sweden not only now as the chair of our executive committee, but it is the largest financial support to UNHCR as a percentage of GDP, and is a pillar of asylum in the world, an important resettlement country, and the most active leader of the creation of a true European asylum system, an objective that is still a little bit far away, but in which Sweden has been extremely engaged in the recent past. If one looks at the present trends of refugee protection in the world, I think that we are witnessing the combination of two very worrying factors. New crises are multiplying, and old crises seem never to die. Since the beginning of 2011, we had Côte d'Ivoire, then we had Libya. We started with Syria, more than a year ago, then Yemen, then the dramatic event in the Horn of Africa, Somalia, with this combination of drought and conflict. And in 2012, we already had the aggravation of Syria, plus Sudan, South Sudan conflict, and now the Mali situation. But at the same time, the Afghanistans of this world, the Democratic Republic of Congos of this world, the Somalias of this world have witnessed conflicts that go on for decades and do not give us lots of hope that they will be solved quickly. What does this represent? Well, in my opinion, first of all, enormous limitations in the international community, both for the prevention of conflict and the timely resolution of conflict. And the first thing I would like to say with humility when we talk about solutions, is that there is never a humanitarian solution for these problems. The solution is always political. We can mitigate the problem, we can help solve individual problems of people, but there is no way to find a true solution if the political capacity of the international community to prevent and to solve conflicts is not enhanced. Now, I've lived the bipolar world when I was a young politician. In the end of the 90s, early 2000, I lived, when I was in office, the unipolar world. I'm not going to discuss whether they were good or bad, but they were relatively predictable. Now, we are no longer in a bipolar world, we are no longer in a unipolar world, but we are not yet in a multipolar world. We are somewhere in between. And unpredictability became the name of the game. We never had a truly global governance system, and we don't have it today. But there were clear, or more or less clear, power relations in the world. Today, not only we do not have a global governance system, but the power relations are not also clear and are becoming more and more unclear as times go by. And this makes conflicts pop up like mushrooms everywhere. And it is very difficult to predict where it will be the next one. I'm sure until the end of the year we'll have a few more. But where will they happen? It's very difficult to predict. And this is exactly the kind of environment in which humanitarian action today takes place. More conflicts erupting, old conflicts not being solved. The number of refugees last year, the new refugees that emerged last year was the highest in a decade. And at the same time, we have more and more refugees in a protracted refugee situation. Today, 70% of refugees under UNHCR mandate have been refugees for more than 5 years. And that, of course, represents a dramatic situation for the families involved in this problem. On the other hand, refugees, according to the 51 Convention, are people fleeing conflict or persecution. But we are seeing more and more people having to move for other reasons. And I'm not speaking about voluntary migration. I'm speaking of this interaction of global megatrends, population growth, urbanization, but also climate change, probably the biggest enhancer of all other factors, food insecurity, water scarcity, competition for resources. All these things are becoming more and more interactive with each other. The world is becoming smaller and smaller. There are, for the first time in the history of mankind, physical limitations to development. And these, on one hand, enhances the possibilities of conflict, increases instability, but on the other hand, drives people to move, even for reasons related to natural disasters, to drought that eliminates the possibilities of human life in some areas of the world, and for other reasons of this nature that do not give people the right to be considered as refugees and create a protection gap in the global institutional system that we have to address the problems of forced displacement. And so, in a system in which we have less governance capacity, bigger pressure of global events that would need even more governance capacity to deal with, we witness more conflict, more instability, more people forced to move because of that, and adding to these people that move because of conflict or persecution and are covered by the 51 Convention, we see more and more people also forced to move for other reasons that are not clearly defined in the international legal protection regime. And this creates a huge challenge for us all, in the sense that we need to respond to a growing number of situations, and at the same time we face new situations for which we don't have the adequate legal protection instruments. Now, in this context, another trend that we are witnessing is the shrinking of the humanitarian space. Most of the conflicts I'm describing do not correspond to the traditional pattern of a war between two countries or a revolution between a rebel movement and a government. More and more, if you look at what's happening today in Mali or what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the East, we have sometimes national armies, international forces, UN and others. We have rebel groups, but we have ethnic militias, we have religious militias, and we have gangsters. And sometimes one can be a gangster in the morning and member of a militia in the afternoon. And this is linked to the fact that more and more areas are becoming totally lawless, and the security conditions become more and more unpredictable. I remember going to Kilinochchi and discuss with the Tamil Tigers access to humanitarian agencies in the area they controlled. I remember even recently in Yemen visiting the area controlled by the Houthis and discussing with the Houthi leadership humanitarian access. When it is clear who's opposing whom, it is easy, or it is at least possible, to establish dialogue with the parties in conflict and to try to find ways to address the needs of the populations that are affected by this conflict. But when you have this multiplicity of actors, and for many of them, humanitarian actors become targets because they are considered to be an obstacle to the realization of their objectives or of their dreams, humanitarian action becomes much more difficult, and we have larger and larger areas in the world where we simply cannot go. And when we simply cannot go, we can imagine the level of suffering that populations will endure and the dramatic violations of human rights that one would be able to witness were we able to be there. But that's not the only reason that is shrinking humanitarian space. Another reason has to do with the fact that in the dialogue, the tense dialogue between the responsibility to protect, or if you want, in a broader way, the human rights agenda and the national sovereignty agenda, I think we have witnessed in the recent past a certain progress made by the human rights agenda, and we have several areas that are key from the point of view of our operations in which governments do not allow humanitarian actors to be there, and in which humanitarian action is severely restricted, invoking national sovereignty or national security concerns. And at the same time, we also have, in many situations, a blurring of the distinctions between what is the military presence of the international community from what is the humanitarian presence of the international community. And this is even true in the context of the UN system. And that is why we need to be careful, for instance, when discussing integrated missions, to make sure that the humanitarian space and the humanitarian principles are preserved. If you have a peacekeeping force in an area where there is no peace to keep, the peacekeeping force risks to become party to the conflict. And if the peacekeeping force becomes party to the conflict, or if a mandate of the Security Council so decides, obviously one needs to create a special space for those that belong to the same umbrella organization, the UN, to be able to act according to humanitarian principles of impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And this is not always easy to establish on the ground, and it's even much more difficult to be perceived by populations. Because if you see the same blue flag with one objective and with another objective, you will be in big difficulties to make the necessary distinctions about what it is the necessary intervention related to Security Council decisions and what is the humanitarian action that doesn't take into account who's in control of the territory of the people that is in need. Because our only concern is the people that is in need and the capacity to reach out to them and to support them. So all these conditions have been shrinking the humanitarian space and limiting our capacity to provide support to the people we care for. And this is particularly difficult when those that flee remain within the borders of their own country. And the trend has been in the recent past to have more internally displaced people than refugees that cross border and are entitled to receive international protection according to international law. If they remain within the borders of their own country, obviously they are to be protected by their own government. And in many circumstances, the government is not able to do so, and in some, the government is probably not willing to do so. And that creates an additional problem, and that is where the tension between the human rights agenda and the national sovereignty agenda becomes even more complex to handle. And this creates an environment that makes the capacity to deliver protection for people displaced more and more threatened in the times to come. Now, from the point of view of looking at asylum and of the acceptance of refugees in today's world, I think we can witness two trends. First, and an encouraging trend, the fact that all neighboring countries of recent crises have kept their borders open. I have been in Nimba County in Liberia, immediately after the eruption of the crisis in Côte d'Ivoire. And I was astonished to see the villagers of the village I visited in the first days of the crisis, sharing the seeds of rice for the next crop with the refugees that were coming. The borders were open, and they were really opening not only the borders, but their houses and their hearts to what they say, and they were saying the brothers and sisters that were coming from the other side. And the same has happened everywhere. I saw Tunisians rushing to the border to help the people that were crossing. And Tunisia and Egypt kept their borders open with an outflow, gigantic outflow from Libya of all kinds of people, refugees, migrants that were fleeing, and nationals of Tunisia and Egypt that were just going back in those circumstances. Today, Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria have kept their borders open. In the dramatic events in Somalia, both Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Yemen have kept their borders open, and now they have 1 million refugees from Somalia within their countries. So it is true that the principle of refugee protection has been recognized by all neighboring countries of the countries in crisis in the recent past. But at the same time, we witness in some areas, namely in the industrialized world, but not only in the industrialized world, we witness a trend in public opinions to become more negative about refugees and asylum seekers and about the protection needs that they have. We see the emergence of populism in political debates. We see some irresponsible media acting in this regard. And we see how this is shaping in some countries, it's not a general trend, how this is shaping new policies that tend to be more restrictive in relation to migration, and being more restrictive in relation to migration sometimes also are more restrictive in relation to refugees, and some policies that mainly has the objective to keep them out of the country and not to let them in to ask for asylum. And this is, of course, another important concern we have at the present time. We recognize that countries have the right to define their own migration policies, but they have the obligation to make those policies protection-friendly and to guarantee to those in need of protection free access to a territory where they can enjoy that protection and the fair treatment of their asylum or other protection claims. And an important signal that I believe the industrialized world needs to give at the present moment to the countries that are still keeping their borders open in the crisis area is that the same attitude prevails everywhere. It would be inconceivable that countries like Liberia or like Jordan would feel that the same countries that are telling them, please keep your borders open to receive the people in need, would apply asylum policies that would be extremely restrictive. In this context, I think it's also important to recognize that 80% of the refugees in the world still remain in the developing world. And that creates the need for what I would call a real new deal in burden and responsibility shared between the developing world and the developed world. And that is where I think it's very important to have a certain number of new developments in the near future. First, resettlement. Resettlement is a very important instrument. It's an instrument of solidarity. It's an instrument that facilitates our work in guaranteeing that the asylum space is maintained in the first countries of asylum. I have no doubt that one of the reasons that facilitated the acceptance that Iraqis had in Syria, in Jordan, and in Lebanon and the other neighboring countries was the very effective resettlement program that took place from these countries of Iraqis in the recent past. And resettlement is also a fantastic opportunity for people with special needs of protection to be able to start a new life. But the number of resettlement opportunities in the world remains very small compared with the needs. We are doing approximately 80,000 resettlement cases every year. We have in UNHCR's area of responsibility more than 10 million refugees. And in need of immediate resettlement, we consider to have about 800,000. So only 1/10 is covered by the resettlement policy. And as it was said, a very limited number of countries cover most of the resettlement opportunities. The United States, Canada, and Australia, and in Europe, largest is Sweden, and then others come, but with much smaller ones. A development that is taking place thanks to the Swedish initiative during the so-called, with the so-called Stockholm Agenda that was launched by the Swedish presidency of the European Union, was the creation of a European voluntary resettlement program. It is created, but it is moving very slowly. And I think it would be extremely important for countries, for a larger number of countries, and I think we have been successful in bringing more countries into the resettlement community, but not yet successful in making sure the quotas increase in a way that is meaningful according to the needs that we witness around the world. But there are other dimensions of burden sharing that are extremely important. As it was said, not only voluntary repatriation, but also local integration are key from the point of view of solutions. But local integration and voluntary repatriation in areas that are extremely poor are only possible with meaningful development programs associated. And so development cooperation projects in areas of return and in the areas of local integration are absolutely crucial, and their volume is still very, very reduced. And at the same time, it is also important to take into account the needs of host communities. When we see people like the ones I mentioned in Nimba County or in southern Tunisia that were sharing their meager resources with the refugees coming in, I think it would be a very important signal to allow international cooperation to target programs to support the host communities, normally in remote areas of countries, sometimes abandoned by their own development programs, national development programs. It would be a very important signal to have development projects targeting those host communities around the world. We as UNHCR are engaging UNDP and the World Bank in the so-called Transition Solutions Initiative and in other projects in order to make sure that the humanitarian community, the development community comes into our solutions approach. We are not a development agency, we don't intend to be. I think it's important that people do what they are supposed to do and do it well, but partnership becomes the name of the game when we see the complexity of the present trends. And this is true in relation to the sustainability of solutions, and this is true in relation to the new trend, which is that refugees are becoming more and more part of the phenomenon of urbanization in the world. And as it was said by the ambassador, I believe this is not only an irreversible trend, I think it's a positive thing. Only those that have visited refugee camps, even if they are well managed, and unfortunately it's not always possible to do so, even those that are well managed, the conditions of life in a refugee camp are always artificial. And the capacity to provide people with the elements of full dignity and full citizenship and full enjoyment of human rights in a refugee camp are never possible. Urban settings are sometimes very challenging, but they offer different kinds of opportunity and of access to a certain number of services and to different prospects in life. But to support people and to guarantee their rights in urban settings is a much more complex endeavor, and that requires a different approach from UNHCR. It's no longer a program that we can do by ourselves or coordinate alone. It is something that needs to engage a number of partners. Partners in the national government, partners in local government, partners in the broader humanitarian community, and in the development community, working together to create the conditions not only for refugees to benefit of better rights and better services, but for the communities where they live to be able to do so. It would be absolutely impossible to target only refugees in this context. This would be, first of all, not effective, and second, it would create levels of tension that would undermine the refugee protection space in those countries. But it is in this context that the word solidarity is extremely important. There is no simple solution for these questions. They all now require, because of their complexity, the involvement of a number of actors. And development, economic and social development, is a key aspect in the stabilization of populations and in the guarantee of adequate protection for the people we care for. And for that to be possible, we need solidarity within the broader humanitarian and development community, but we need a very strong commitment of the developed world in order to create the conditions for those countries that are still receiving the largest number of refugees in the world to be able to cope with the challenge, to be able to be faithful in relation to their international protection regime commitment, and at the same time to be able to provide to the refugees the minimum of living conditions that we all consider essential for human dignity. It's not easy to know where things will develop in the years to come. We are witnessing a very complex economic and financial situation in the world. And I'm afraid that this will undermine many of the aspects of development cooperation and humanitarian cooperation in the near future. let's hope that people understand that solidarity is not only a question of being nice or being good, it's a question of enlightened self-interest. And I will end with an example. Mali today. Mali is a forgotten situation. A lot of attention goes to Syria. Some attention goes to Sudan. Mali practically never appears in our global media and in the political debates that we witness. But when one looks at what's happening now in northern Mali, we see the following situation. We have a Tuareg independentist rebellion that was led traditionally by a secular Tuareg movement, the MNLA, plus a Islamic Tuareg movement, radical Islamic Tuareg movement called Ansar Din, which aim is the Islamization of the country and to apply Sharia in the whole country. We have the Mojao, which is a multi-ethnic, extreme Islamic group called Mouvement pour l'unité de la Jihad en Afrique occidentale. We have the Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb operating in the same area. We have 200 to 300 fighters of Boko Haram of Nigeria operating again in this same area. The weapons came from Libya. And most of the fighters that are in these movements came from Libya because they were members either of the Libyan army or of the militias supporting Gaddafi. And we are now witnessing the presence of Afghans and Somalis fighting in northern Mali. And in my opinion, it's very simple. If the international community remains unable to address the political problems of Mali, and remains unable to provide effective humanitarian assistance, not only to those that are in the conflict area, but to all those in the region that also suffer from the devastating impact of drought at the present moment, one of the largest food insecurity problems in the world, we risk to have a global security problem from Libya to Nigeria, from Mauritania to Somalia, everything coming together and representing a major threat for the countries in Northern Africa that were the protagonists of the Arab Spring, not to forget that many European countries, and even in this part of the world, have large diasporas that come from many of these countries, which means that this situation that nobody cares about can become an important element of disturbance of global peace and security. So, to be able to express solidarity, to address effectively the problem of the people that Mauritania, Niger, and Burkina Faso are receiving and supporting in their extremely difficult contexts, to address the problems of human security, food security in the region, to help stabilize these populations, is, as I said, not only a question of being nice and expressing solidarity, is, in my opinion, in the vital self-interest of everybody, even in quite far away regions. And I also think that it is better and more effective to appeal to enlightened self-interest than to appeal to solidarity, even if our book is about solidarity. It would not be acceptable if it would be written that it is about enlightened self-interest.
I want to go to your questions in a moment. I just have a couple of my own. Actually, I'd made a lot of notes from the book of things I hoped the High Commissioner would say, and he said almost all of them. But one I want to focus on in particular is the extraordinary rise in the numbers of internally displaced persons, the famous IDPs. At the start of 2005, they numbered 5.5 million. They are now close to 15 million. That's threefold.
Supported by us.
Oh, okay, those supported by, well, my next question was, I even saw a reference at some point to somebody saying that UNHCR should no longer be called the refugee agency because you have stateless people you represent, and you also have these IDPs, which, as you just said, actually outnumber, at least the ones that you deal with, outnumber the numbers of refugees you deal with. I just wanted to ask you if you could pursue that a bit more. Do you, Do you need more power or access now to deal with people who are not refugees but instead are internally displaced, or do you have the adequate means to treat them even though they are still within the borders of their own country?
Well, I think that there is a fundamental distinction here to be made, which is about legal regimes and mandates. The 50th UN Convention is a very strong convention. I doubt if the 50th UN Convention would be drafted today that it would be as good as it is. That's one of the reasons why I'm not in favor of reopening the discussion about how to change the 50th UN Convention. It doesn't cover all kinds of populations, but for those that are covered, and they are an important group of very vulnerable people, they really foresee a very strong protection regime, and they give UNHCR a very strong mandate and a capacity to interfere and to intervene that, I have to say, is generally respected by states and very much taken into account more and more by courts. In the decisions of the European Court on Human Rights, for instance, several times the statements provided by UNHCR as amicus curiae are quoted and are having an important influence in the jurisprudence of the European Court on Human Rights. But so there we have a very powerful instrument. When you talk about internal displacement, UNHCR has no mandate. And not only UNHCR has no mandate, but nobody has any mandate. The mandate is the mandate of the country itself. I mean, it's the country itself that is supposed to provide protection to their own citizens. Now, the problem is that in many circumstances the country is not able to do so, but worst, sometimes we have the authorities being part of the problem, not part of the solution. So there, it's not a question of how does UNHCR work, it's a question how does the broader humanitarian community, in which UNHCR is a part, and we are organized in the so-called cluster approach, and we try with humanitarian coordinators, the other agencies, the NGO movement, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, to come together and to offer to governments the possibility to provide protection and assistance to these people. And sometimes it works well, and sometimes it works less well, and sometimes it doesn't work at all. And the shrinking of the humanitarian space I mentioned is particularly dramatic in relation to internal displacement. In most situations, in refugee protection areas, there is access, because the government has no reason not to allow us to have access to a place where those that came from another country are. But in internal displacement, especially when there is a conflict situation, governments are reluctant to allow foreigners, for instance, to be present in certain areas. And that is where the difficulties are. So the approach is different. The only legally binding instrument that exists today about internal displacement is the African Convention, but it's not yet ratified by a sufficient number of countries. We are getting there. But even there is no agency with the powers that UNHCR has in relation to refugee protection. So I think that the question of internal displacement is, in my opinion, probably the most relevant questions of this tense relationship I mentioned between the human rights agenda and the national sovereignty agenda. And we see it in many discussions, namely in the Security Council and others, very much in the center of concerns of the international community. And I don't think, to be honest, that we are making progress.
I have a similar question, and then we'll go to the floor. On the institution of asylum, which of course is a national issue, applied, as I understand it, in all kinds of random fashion around the world. Is that an area where UNHCR can affect any change that would be international, to bring a certain consistency to the institution of asylum around the world?
Well, there are several initiatives in this regard. There is in Europe an initiative of trying to build a European asylum system, which is essential because if you are a Somali and if you ask for asylum in Europe in 2011, the chances to receive protection, not only asylum, but any kind of protection, would vary between 8 and 93%. So this demonstrates how dysfunctional the asylum system is in a continent where, according to the Dublin II regulations, states should be able to send people back to the country of entry in the European Union for asylum to be granted there. So the efforts that are being made in order to build a true European asylum system, there are a certain number of directives that are now being amended by the Commission and being discussed by member states. We are very strongly involved in this work. So there is this effort at European level. There are other interesting regional approaches that are taking place, even if sometimes in a less formal way. For instance, we were now charged in the context of the so-called Bali process. It's a process led by Australia and Indonesia. A support office will be created, I think to a certain extent inspired in the European Asylum Support Office. A support office will be created in Bangkok to provide support both in migration and asylum to the countries of the region. So there is some evolution in that. I think it's important to recognize that the African Convention on Refugees is an even better instrument from the legal point of view than the 50 UN Convention, and that in Latin America an important breakthrough was made with the so-called Cartagena Declaration that establishes also a protection regime that is stronger than the protection regime that exists in general based only on the 50 UN Convention. So there is indeed a number of global initiatives or regional initiatives of this sort. On the other hand, we are working more and more with states to allow states to create their own refugee status determination procedures. UNHCR still does directly, based on our mandate, refugee status determination on 87 countries of the world, which, I mean, is enormous. I don't think this is positive. I think it is important to have more and more states being able to do it properly, with, of course, the monitoring role that UNHCR can provide. And I have to say that there are some interesting developments. Many countries are now, for instance, Tunisia, after the Arab Spring, is developing its own asylum law, and many other countries are developing its own asylum laws. And in the ministerial conference that we had to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the convention, there were a number of commitments of countries to improve their asylum legislations and to also improve practical aspects related to rights of people and related procedures and related to integration.
Thank you. I would love to see some questions. Just raise your hand. I'll have a wait for the microphone, please, over here on this side, and then we'll take, right after you, we'll take this second question here on the aisle and answer them both at once. And please identify yourself.
My name is Jan Paul Brekke. I'm a researcher at the Institute for Social Research in Oslo, Norway. I have a question regarding the resettlement program of the UNHCR. You speak very highly of it, and it's very interesting to hear a bit more about how that can be strengthened. Does UNHCR see a challenge as far as capacity goes? What if the 80,000 you now handled through the program would be doubled or tripled? Wouldn't that be an enormous administrative burden, or challenge at least, to the UNHCR? Secondly, do you see a trade-off between resettlement and asylum policies? In my country, the right-wing politicians would argue that, okay, we could increase the quota of resettled refugees, but then we would have to decrease the number we allow through the asylum system. So a comment on that would be nice as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And the second question, gentleman in the pink shirt.
Thank you. George Andreopoulos from the City University of New York. I also have a question about the issue of asylum, but how is this affected by the so-called continuing global war on terror, which, as we know, and this actually combined with the rising xenophobia and populism in certain countries that you alluded, High Commissioner, in the presentation, it seems offers a wonderful excuse for states to use the asylum procedure and the so-called security concern to restrict access to legitimate refugees. So in that context, could you please tell us a little bit more, what does your organization do to ensure that these refugee status procedures that different states are putting in place are applied in a way so as to minimize the negative impact from this problem?
Excellent, thank you. Could you take those two questions and then we'll get some more?
First, capacity in resettlement. Obviously, there are always capacity problems, but that is not the bottleneck. The bottleneck today is not the capacity to refer resettlement cases, is the capacity to accept the referred cases. Our capacity has more or less doubled in the last 5 years, and we are ready to, I mean, it's not so difficult to invest in capacity if necessary. What does make sense is to refer people, and then that people being there waiting without any chance to be resettled. So the question here is indeed, at the present moment, is to increase the number of vacancies that are opened for resettlement opportunities. Obviously, if we double it, we will have to double our capacity, but that is not in itself a dramatic problem, and it's not extremely expensive. I mean, compared with other things, and I mean, if you see the success stories of resettled refugees that came into this country or into Norway or into Sweden, and how things have dramatically changed when they were living without any kind of hope in Dadaab or in Doload or any other of these dramatic refugee camps. I mean, I must say, there was a big discussion in UNHCR about if resettlement should only be a protection tool or if it should also be a strategic instrument at a certain moment. And to be honest, I mean, my feeling was the more we do, the better, because when we see how important it is for the life of people, we should really invest in that. Now, you raised a very important problem. We have today in some governments a difficult debate, because they say we shouldn't allow people to jump the queue. This is an expression I heard from two governments already in 2012. Two, refugee hosting countries. And we are ready to increase our resettlement programs, but let's close our borders. Let's not allow people to come, for instance, by boat or whatever, illegally, because they should go to the queue to have a resettlement opportunity so this expression, jump the queue. So this is a real problem. Today, we have a certain number of countries that are trying to create this, I'd say, this quid pro quo. We are ready to increase resettlement opportunities with the condition that we close our borders to those that come spontaneously to our country. It is a problem that we are handling. I mean, sometimes it's a public debate, and there the civil society is very important, because fortunately we have very strong support in the civil society for this discussion, but it is a problem. But there is the other way that I mentioned, that is the positive feedback. In many countries, the fact that our resettlement programs from those countries has dramatically improved the attitude to receive refugees. As I mentioned, in countries like Jordan or Syria or Lebanon for the Iraqis, that was extremely important. And the Burundians, the resettlement of Burundians from Tanzania was very instrumental at a certain moment to convince the government to accept the naturalization of a number of Burundians. So obviously the two discussions are there, but I think that I'm optimistic about this debate. Now, the war on terror, to be honest, in relation to limitations to physical access to territories, more important than the security concerns are the migration policies. I think that, for instance, in Europe, there is a schizophrenic debate on migration. My country has an index. My country, fortunately, even in the present crisis, still has a positive attitude towards migration. You don't have any political group that is making a campaign using migration. And migration into Portugal is now taking place, even if a lot of migration out of Portugal is now also taking place, but with the financial crisis. In countries like mine, with 1.3 of fertility index, migration is an absolute vital element of survival of the society. Now, I remember my father was 93 when he passed away 2 years ago, and he had a stroke 1 year before. So he was semi-paralyzed, he was going to hospital, coming back home, And when he was home, there was always someone there to help. My mother specifically to take care of him. It was not a full-fledged nurse, but I mean someone with nursing capacity to help and to wash him. All this kind of work. So it's not highly sophisticated work. It's work that is essential and that in Europe became vital with the aging population that exists. When I visited my father in my parents' home, I met 7 of these people. Only 2 were Portuguese. But I'm sure that if this would be in France, there would be no French. If this would be in Sweden, there would be no Swede. All would be migrants. So, migration is a vital component of our societies. Of course, it needs to be managed. It needs, but an attitude to consider migration as a problem that is dramatic and is undermining societies is something that doesn't make sense. Now, what is, in my opinion, also dramatic is many times even mainstream parties are afraid to tell the truth to the people and to fight these populist xenophobic trends and to explain the reality. We need also migration. So let's see how we can handle it properly. But the truth is that this has been in several countries a challenging question, especially in border management policies and in other, and it has indeed limited access to asylum seekers, to bona fide asylum seekers, to territories, because it's very difficult to distinguish. And to be honest, sometimes even an asylum seeker has no other way to move but illegally. There is no way for an asylum seeker to move in certain areas legally because he would not be allowed to do so. And so some countries have criminalized, for instance, illegal entry, which is, of course, a very dangerous development, in my opinion. And, of course, it limits, again, the rights of asylum seekers if they are considered to. So this has been a very difficult debate. There are 2 positive things here. First, the civil society has been very active and very engaged in support to keeping borders open for those in need of protection and allowing them to have a fair treatment, as I mentioned, of their claims in my intervention. And the second thing is the decision of courts. Courts, and namely we are talking about Europe, that is the zone I know better, but not only in Europe, courts in this part of the world, courts in other areas have been extremely important in guaranteeing that the 50th UN Convention is fully applied. I remember a recent decision of the European Court on Human Rights on the pushbacks from Italy to Libya, condemning Italy and forcing them to pay. In these courts, usually it's not UNHCR that presents the case, it's the victim that presents the case. But we act, as I said, from the amicus curiae perspective. We had another recent decision in relation to returns to Greece. We have been clearly against returns to Greece because Greece, in our opinion, has not the capacity to provide adequate protection at the present moment. And there was a decision again of the European Court of Human Rights against Belgium in relation to returns to Greece and a few others. And this is something that we believe is very important. The rule of law, where the rule of law can be applied. And this is what makes me be optimistic in this context. It's true that we have these xenophobic trends, but it's also true that we see different evolutions and positive evolutions. To give again the example of Sweden, the present government has improved the asylum policy. And the same can be said about several other countries, even in my part of the world. So we cannot say that there is a negative trend everywhere, and there are instruments. And my appeal is for all those engaged with the cause to act in their different capacities, academia, civil society, courts, to make sure that international law prevails and that people get what they really need. Because, one aspect I would like to say, the procedures in relation to security have been making the resettlement process much slower than in the past in relation to, and this has been a very challenging situation. It made all these security checks, made things slow. And the other thing is we have one of our key priorities is reduce the levels of detention of asylum seekers. And in several parts of the world, there's still too much detention. Again, in the US, we have a positive development with the parole guidelines, but we still have very high levels of detention of asylum seekers.
I have time for a few more questions. I have Jeff Laurenti, here's one. There's a second one on the aisle and a third one here in front. We'll do 3 this time, and that'll probably be the end.
Jeff Laurenti with the Century Foundation. Commissioner Guterres, I'd like to pick up 2 of the items you just discussed a bit or touched on in your response to the first round of questions. You noted that Syria, Jordan had been major recipients of the flood of refugees from Iraq. Syria, of course, is now generating its own refugee flow. First, to what extent are the Iraqi refugees still in Syria still being taken care of, or are they in some way imperiled during Syria's own crisis? And how is the flow, I assume, still much smaller, across Syria's borders into its neighbors being handled by UNHCR in the current moment, since there are questions of Free Syrian Army, et cetera, trying to do recruitment? And then the other, I wonder whether your warm endorsement of the need for accepting migration by these wealthier societies that feel now very much under economic pressure, this kind of rightist populist resentment, may actually cloud your own mission as head of refugees. That is, the distinction between certifiable refugees, asylum seekers, and all that, orderly processes, may be overwhelmed in the public mind by this seemingly unstoppable surge, both in Europe, across the Mediterranean. You pointed to Italy having drawn unwelcome attention in turning boats back, but the US had done a bit of that too from Haiti in the Caribbean. How does trying to advance the cause of refugee resettlement risk being overwhelmed by perceptions of migration generally? And are those countries that UNHCR is going after becoming a little more chary of giving money to you when you try to make them confront their responsibilities under the convention?
Thank you. On this.
Do you have a question? I do. Elizabeth Cafferty, Women's Refugee Commission. As we know, the majority of refugees and displaced persons continue to be women and children. And in our work, we still see that new programs being developed and current programs in the field are not meeting women and children's specific protection needs or efficiently delivering services that they are in desperate need of. So given this situation, I'd love to hear a little bit about what HCR is doing to address this and what are the sort of key challenges remaining.
Thank you. And finally, Ann Phillips in the front row.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you. That was really a fascinating presentation. I thank you very much. I'm Ann Phillips. I'm on the board of IPI. I, at one time, was with Save the Children, which is an international community development organization, and I chaired the International Program Committee for the board. And I had the opportunity to visit our programs internationally. One of the most complex problems for us to deal with was in Guatemala, because there was a huge migration from the countryside into Guatemala City. And as you indicated, that is a much more difficult and complex situation. The peasants who remained in the countryside lived in actual communities, and so it was easier to cope with them. We developed something called linkage, where we linked up with other development organizations, even charities, or we found that we could do much more effective work in dealing with the migrants or the internally displaced persons that way. You mentioned that in urban situations, solidarity was particularly important. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit or give us examples of, you mentioned that the migration into urban areas are really happening all over the world now. How you are coping with that, if you would, I'd be very interested.
Good.
First, our program in Syria remains I mean, I wouldn't say untouched, because, for instance, we have 18,000 people waiting for resettlement, because the resettlement process was interrupted because of security reasons, and very few countries accept to go on doing resettlement from Syria. But we have now about 100,000 Iraqi refugees in Syria that are supported by UNHCR. And we have even enlarged our scope of operations, because WFP has withdrawn, I mean, by an agreement that was established from the food distribution, and this is now being done by us, not through a typical food distribution, but a support to the families approach with cash and vouchers. So the program goes on. And I have to say it goes on with the acceptance of the Syrian authorities and the cooperation of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. And the hospitality of Syria has not been touched by this crisis. Of course, some refugees that were in the most dramatically impacted areas moved into Aleppo and Damascus, but it has always been in Aleppo and Damascus, that, especially in Damascus, that the program was, because most of the people came to Damascus, that is normal. And I think it's important to recognize this and to say it. Now, I would say that if I would have to select a country that really, in my opinion, would now deserve a very strong commitment of solidarity of the international community, is Jordan. Jordan has the Palestinian refugees, Jordan has the Iraqi refugees, and now Jordan had to open the doors to the Syrian refugees. And I mean, even if I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned here that 30,000, no, I think I didn't mention it, it was in another. In Jordan, we have about 30,000 Syrian refugees that are being supported, that are being assisted. But the Jordanian government indicates the number of Syrians that came into Jordan, minus the number of Syrians that moved from Jordan to Syria in the last few months, as 130,000, which means that many Syrians are living in Jordan, but they are benefiting from the subsidies that the Jordanian government gives to bread, to food, and to other things. So the costs, and they are, of course, using water, and water is the most scarce resource in Jordan. So if there is a country that, in my opinion, at the present moment, deserves and needs a lot of international support, is Jordan in this very complex situation. And of course, we are very actively engaged with the Jordanian government in support to these Syrians in need, as we are in Lebanon. Turkey is different, because Turkey is essentially doing it by itself. They have the capacity to do it by itself. But this program is a growing program and a worrying program. Now, migration. We are not a migration agency, and I have not a migration mandate. What is true is that refugee protection becomes easier when you have normal migration policies, and refugee protection becomes more difficult when you have extremely restrictive migration policies. And why? Because unfortunately many of the refugees and asylum seekers move together with other migrants in mixed flows. And so if the regime is blind and rejects everybody, those that are in need of protection cannot be detected. And this is, of course, something that is of our mandate and is of our concern. But the opinions I gave about migration are my personal opinions. They don't, about my country and I mean, what I've seen with my father, I mean, this is not UNHCR doctrine, it's my own feeling. And I've been in government, and I'm quite, my conscience is quite well, in the sense that we tried to do everything. We did two movements, two operations to legalize illegal migrants, and we tried to adapt our society to effective integration and things of the sort. I am not in favor of blind migration. I'm in favor of international cooperation between countries of origin, countries of transit, countries of destination, good integration policies, and a lot of other things. What for me is obvious is that migration is part of the solution. It's not part of the problem of modern societies. And it has always been so in the history of mankind. So migration is not a new phenomenon of the 21st century. It has been like this. This country would not exist without migration. No? I mean, so let's take things as they are. It's a normal thing. It has always been a normal thing in the world, and it should be discussed as a normal thing. Having said so, we should be able to fight traffickers and smugglers, and we should be able to do lots of other things. And I'm not for an irresponsible management of borders. Countries have the obligation to manage their borders in a responsible way, but they should do it also in a protection-sensitive way. That's our... I must say, even in situations in which we criticize the asylum policy of governments, we have never been threatened or negatively impacted in the financial assistance in UNHCR. And this is something I have to say. It's absolutely true. We have had many discussions. I've been in Australia in recent, a very complex discussion with the boat and the not pushbacks, the boat people coming. And Australia is a very strong supporter of UNHCR activities financially. And it was never raised that, on the contrary, they always said, okay, we have these discussions, but our financial support to your activities is absolutely out of the question. So I have to say that the attitude of governments has been extremely positive, separating the humanitarian space from the political space. And that, I think, is something that should be said because it's true. And I have not one single example in 7 years of a country that told us, if you do not accept this, we will reduce the funding or whatever. Not one single example. Women and children, indeed, a central issue in our concerns. I would give 2 examples of things that we are trying to do. Enhance very strongly our SGBV program. And we have approved, and we are now trying to fundraise to implement our new education strategy. So, these are 2 examples of many things that it's a comprehensive approach that is required, but it's very much in the center of our concerns. Linkage and solidarity in urban contexts. I think the basic concept is the following. You cannot have a refugee program in the slums of a megalopolis in the developing world. You need to have programs targeting areas of which programs the refugees benefit. But you cannot just go and support refugees. You need to support vulnerable populations, knowing that the refugees are in the most vulnerable of them. And that is why this needs to be integrated in a comprehensive approach by not UNHCR only, but a set of entities, starting by the national and local authorities, but involving all the other humanitarian and development agencies and the bilateral forms of cooperation that exist with many countries around the world. This approach is not, I cannot say that we are doing it perfectly everywhere. No, we have revised our urban strategy just 1 year ago. And this is, we are learning by doing. So this is something that is rather new. In the past, we were not so involved in urban refugee populations. And to be honest, it was the Iraqi program that has opened our eyes, because the Iraqis did not go to camps. They went to Damascus, to Amman, to Beirut, and we had to find a way to help them in this context. And that inspired us to now look into a new strategy, but what we discovered is that we cannot do it by ourselves. A new strategy to be effective needs to be done in a broader context, and this is a challenge for all of us.
Well, if I see no more hands, we're coming almost to the end anyway. Let me just say in conclusion, about 2 months ago when the phone call first came here proposing that we host António Guterres, we said yes right away. I think I can speak for the mission of Sweden. When they had the chance to co-sponsor this with us, they said yes right away. And I think I can presume to say the reasons we were both so agreeable have been demonstrated this morning. António Guterres, on the basis of experience and on the basis of being able to explain the mission of his agency, what they do, why they do it, what they would like to do if they got more power and permission to do so, is a winning combination. So I wanted to first of all say thank you so much for coming back to IPI. You're always welcome here. Thank you all very much for your attention and your questions.
Thank you very much.